Before we begin, if you value stories like this, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. And down in the comments, tell us what city, state, or country you are watching from. Now imagine this. A 23-year-old sergeant, 12 exhausted soldiers, 4 days without sleep, surrounded by 150 enemy troops in the freezing rain. A German tank commander rolls up to your position, gun barrel pointed at your foxhole, and offers you one chance to surrender. You are out of ammunition. Your men are shaking from cold and fear. No one is coming to help you. What would you say? Would you have the courage to refuse? Because on October 24, 1944, on a forgotten hill in the Vosges forest of eastern France, Technical Sergeant Charles Culage looked into the eyes of that tank commander and said no. What happened next became one of the most extraordinary forgotten battles of the Second World War. This is that story. The Vosges Mountains in late October carry a particular kind of misery that soldiers remember long after the war ends. It is not the dramatic cold of winter or the oppressive heat of summer, but something worse. A damp, penetrating chill that seeps through wool and cotton and skin until it settles in the bones. The forest is ancient, dense with pine and oak, and the paths between the trees become rivers of mud when the autumn rains begin. Visibility drops to 20 yards on good days, 10 yards when the fog rolls in from the valleys. Sound behaves strangely here. A rifle shot 200 yards away can seem like it came from the next ridge, while voices from the foxhole beside you can vanish entirely in the thick air. It is terrain that favors ambush, concealment, and fear. It is a place where small units can disappear entirely, swallowed by the forest and the mist, and no one would know they were gone until days later when the roll call came up short. Technical Sergeant Charles Culage had been fighting in this forest for weeks. At 23 years old, he carried the kind of exhaustion that ages a man beyond counting. 14 months of continuous combat had carved away everything soft in him. He had landed in North Africa, fought through Sicily, waded ashore at Salerno, and pushed north through the mountains of Italy before being reassigned to France. He had seen friends cut down by machine gun fire, watched men bleed out in his arms, heard the wet sound of shrapnel tearing through human flesh so many times that it no longer made him flinch. He did not talk much anymore. When he gave orders, his voice was calm and flat, the voice of a man who had learned that panic spreads faster than fire and kills just as many. His face was lean, unshaven, streaked with dirt. His eyes were the eyes of someone who had stopped thinking about home, because thinking about home made it harder to do what needed to be done. On the morning of October 24th, Culage was given command of 12 men and ordered to establish a defensive position on Hill 623, a low rise barely worthy of the name. It was not a strategic strongpoint. It was not critical terrain. It was simply a piece of high ground that someone in headquarters had decided needed to be held, while the rest of the division pushed east toward the German border. Culage did not question the order. He had long ago stopped questioning orders. He gathered his men, checked their ammunition, and began the hike up the muddy trail that wound through the trees toward the hilltop. Of the 12 soldiers under his command, only 2 had been in combat before. The rest were replacements, fresh from training camps in England or the United States, boys who had been in Europe for less than a month. They were 18, 19, 20 years old. Their uniforms were still relatively clean. Their helmets sat awkwardly on their heads because they had not yet learned to adjust the chin straps properly. They carried too much gear, stuffed their packs with things they thought they might need, and they talked too much because silence made them nervous. Culage watched them as they climbed, saw the way they flinched at distant artillery fire, noticed how their eyes darted toward every sound in the forest. He did not judge them. He had been the same once, a lifetime ago. The hilltop was unremarkable, a clearing perhaps 50 yards across, surrounded on all sides by dense forest. The ground was soft, covered in fallen pine needles and patches of moss. Visibility extended maybe 30 yards before the trees swallowed everything. Culage walked the perimeter slowly, studying the approaches, calculating fields of fire. He placed his 2 machine guns on opposite sides of the clearing, positioned to cover the most likely avenues of approach. He had the men dig foxholes in a rough circle, each position within shouting distance of the next. The soil was easier to dig than expected, soft and loamy, but it also meant the holes filled with water almost immediately. The men cursed as they dug, their boots sinking into the mud, their hands blistering on the wooden handles of entrenching tools. Culage said nothing. He just dug his own foxhole and waited for them to finish. By midday, the position was as ready as it would ever be. The foxholes were shallow, barely deep enough to provide cover from small arms fire, but they would have to do. Culage distributed the ammunition carefully, making sure each position had enough rifle rounds and grenades. He checked the machine guns personally, running his hands over the belts of ammunition, making sure the feed mechanisms were clean and the barrels were free of obstruction. He had learned in Italy that machine guns saved lives. A single gun, well-positioned and well-maintained, could stop an entire platoon if the gunner kept his nerve. He looked at the 2 young men assigned to the guns, saw the uncertainty in their faces, and spoke to them quietly, telling them exactly what to do when the time came. Aim low. Fire in short bursts. Do not let the barrel overheat. Do not waste ammunition on targets you cannot see. They nodded, but he was not sure they understood. The afternoon passed in silence. The men ate cold rations, drank water from their canteens, and tried to stay warm. The temperature was dropping. The rain that had been threatening all morning finally began, a light drizzle that turned the clearing into a field of mud and made everything slippery. Culage sat in his foxhole, his rifle across his knees, and watched the tree line. He did not expect trouble yet. The front was supposed to be a mile to the east. This hill was behind American lines, a quiet sector where nothing ever happened. He allowed himself a brief moment of hope that maybe, just this once, the war would leave them alone. That hope died at dusk. The first indication that something was wrong came not from a sound but from a silence. The birds stopped singing. The forest, which had been alive with the rustle of wind through branches and the occasional call of a crow, went completely still. Culage felt the change immediately, a tightening in his chest, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. He had felt this before in Italy just before an ambush. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, but before he could speak, the tree line erupted with rifle fire. The Germans came out of the fog like ghosts. Culage saw shapes moving between the trees, heard the sharp crack of Mauser rifles, saw the muzzle flashes blinking in the growing darkness. He fired back instinctively, his rifle bucking against his shoulder, and around him the clearing exploded into chaos. The machine guns opened up with a roar, tracers arcing into the forest, and the replacements who had never been in combat finally learned what it felt like to have people trying to kill them. They fired wildly, some of them screaming, some of them frozen in their foxholes with their rifles forgotten. Culage shouted orders, his voice cutting through the noise, telling them to aim, to breathe, to keep firing. He moved from position to position, slapping shoulders, pointing out targets, dragging one terrified private out of his paralysis and shoving the rifle back into his hands. The first assault lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. The Germans pushed forward in short rushes, using the trees for cover, firing as they moved. They were disciplined, professional, and there were far more of them than Culage had bullets. But the machine guns did their work. Bodies fell in the tree line. The advance slowed, hesitated, and then broke. The Germans pulled back into the forest, and the clearing fell silent except for the ringing in everyone's ears and the sound of men gasping for air. Culage counted his men. All 12 were still alive, though 2 were wounded, one with a bullet through the shoulder, the other with shrapnel in his leg. He bandaged them himself, working quickly in the darkness, and redistributed their ammunition to the others. Then he waited. He knew the Germans would come again. This had not been a probe or a skirmish. This had been a deliberate attack, and it had failed, which meant the next one would be bigger. The second assault came an hour later, this time from a different direction. The Germans had moved through the forest, repositioning in the darkness, and when they attacked they came from the west instead of the east. Culage had anticipated this. He had moved one of the machine guns, setting it up to cover the new approach, and when the attack began the gun opened fire immediately, raking the tree line with long bursts. The Germans went to ground, returned fire, and then pushed forward again. Culage could see them more clearly now, could make out the shapes of their helmets, the gray of their uniforms. He shot one man who was sprinting toward the clearing, watched him crumple and fall, and felt nothing. He had stopped feeling anything about killing a long time ago. This assault was heavier than the first. The Germans used grenades, hurling them into the foxholes, and the explosion sent geysers of mud into the air. One landed between 2 positions, and the concussion knocked both men unconscious for several seconds. Culage dragged them back, checked them for injuries, and then returned to his own foxhole. His rifle was hot to the touch. He reloaded, sighted on a figure moving through the trees, and fired. The figure dropped. He reloaded again. The battle settled into a rhythm. The Germans would attack, get caught by machine gun fire, take casualties, and pull back. Then they would regroup and attack again from a different angle. Culage moved constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few minutes, always repositioning to wherever the threat was greatest. He fired until his rifle barrel was too hot to touch, then switched to his pistol, then back to his rifle after it cooled. He threw grenades when the Germans got close, aiming for the muzzle flashes in the darkness. He shouted orders, encouragement, threats, whatever it took to keep his men firing, and somehow, impossibly, they held. By midnight, the Germans stopped coming. The forest went silent again, and the only sound was the rain, which had intensified into a steady downpour. Culage slumped in his foxhole, his hands shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. His uniform was soaked through. Water pooled at the bottom of his foxhole, and he sat in it because there was nowhere else to sit. Around him, his men were in similar states. Some were crying. Some were staring at nothing. One was praying quietly, his lips moving in the darkness. Culage did not stop them. He just sat and listened to the rain and tried to estimate how much ammunition they had left. The count was not good. They had burned through more than half their rifle ammunition and nearly all the machine gun belts. The grenades were almost gone. If the Germans came again with the same intensity, they would not be able to hold. Culage considered his options. He could withdraw, pull his men off the hill, and try to make it back to American lines. But he did not know where American lines were anymore. The fighting had been fluid, chaotic, and for all he knew they were surrounded. He could send a runner, try to get word back to headquarters that they needed reinforcement and resupply. But the nearest radio was miles away, and sending a man through the forest at night in enemy territory was a death sentence. So he stayed. He told his men to conserve ammunition, to hold fire unless they had a clear target, and to pray that morning would bring relief. Morning brought fog. It rolled in with the dawn, thick and white, reducing visibility to less than 10 feet. Culage could not see the tree line. He could not see the foxholes on the other side of the clearing. He could barely see his own hands. The fog turned the hill into a ghost world where sound was the only sense that mattered, and every crack of a twig, every rustle of movement, sent a jolt of fear through the defenders. They sat in their foxholes, rifles pointed at nothing, straining to hear the approach of an enemy they could not see. The Germans did not attack. Instead, they shelled the hill with mortars. The first rounds came without warning, sudden explosions that tore through the fog and shook the ground. Culage threw himself flat as shrapnel screamed overhead, felt the concussion punch the air from his lungs, tasted dirt and blood. The mortars were not accurate, probably fired blind through the fog, but they did not need to be accurate. The hill was small, and every explosion had a chance of hitting something. Men screamed. Culage crawled through the mud, checking positions, pulling the wounded into deeper cover, shouting reassurances he did not believe. One shell landed directly on a foxhole, and when the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but a crater. Culage stared at it, his mind refusing to process what it meant, and then he moved on because there was nothing else to do. The shelling lasted an hour. When it stopped, the silence was worse than the noise. Culage counted his men again. 9 left. 3 dead, not from bullets but from high explosive shells that had erased them so completely there was nothing to bury. The survivors were in shock, some of them wounded, all of them on the edge of breaking. Culage knew he had to do something, say something, give them a reason to keep going. He crawled from foxhole to foxhole, spoke quietly to each man, reminded them that they were still alive, that they had held, that help was coming. He did not believe the last part, but he said it anyway because belief was a weapon, and right now it was the only weapon he had left. The fog lifted around noon, and with it came the next assault. This time the Germans used a different tactic. They did not charge. They advanced slowly, methodically, using covering fire to pin the defenders while small teams moved forward through the trees. It was professional, coordinated, and terrifyingly effective. Culage recognized the technique immediately. These were not conscripts or second-rate troops. These were veterans, possibly Waffen-SS, men who knew what they were doing. He adjusted his defense, concentrated his remaining machine gun on the most dangerous approach, and told his men to hold their fire until the Germans were close enough that every shot would count. The firefight that followed was brutal and intimate. The Germans reached the edge of the clearing, close enough that Culage could see their faces, see the determination in their eyes. He shot one at a distance of 20 yards, saw the man's helmet fly off, saw him fall. Another German hurled a grenade, and Culage caught it in midair and threw it back before it exploded. The blast caught 2 Germans in the open, and they went down screaming. The machine gun hammered away, cutting down anyone who tried to cross the clearing, and for a few minutes it seemed like they might hold again. But then the gun jammed. The gunner, a 19-year-old replacement named Morrison, panicked. He slapped at the gun, tried to clear the jam, and in his haste made it worse. Culage saw what was happening and ran to the position, sliding into the foxhole beside Morrison. He grabbed the gun, pulled back the charging handle, cleared the jam with practiced hands, and got the weapon firing again in less than 10 seconds. But those 10 seconds had been enough. The Germans had used the pause to advance, and now they were inside the perimeter. What happened next was chaos. Hand-to-hand fighting in the mud and the rain, men grappling with bayonets and rifle butts, shouting and cursing and dying. Culage emptied his pistol into a German soldier who lunged at him with a knife, felt the man's weight collapse against him, shoved the body away and looked for the next threat. There was no time to think, no time to plan. It was pure reaction, pure survival. He picked up a rifle from a dead American, fired it until it was empty, then used it as a club. Around him, his men were fighting with the same desperate ferocity, and somehow, impossibly, they drove the Germans back. The clearing fell silent again. Culage stood in the center of it, breathing hard, his hands covered in blood that might have been his or might have been someone else's. 6 men left, half his original force gone. The machine gun was still working, but they were down to their last belt of ammunition. Rifle rounds could be counted on fingers. Grenades were gone entirely. The sun was setting again, and he knew the Germans would come back in the darkness, and this time there would be nothing left to stop them. That night was the longest of Culage's life. The men huddled in their foxholes, too exhausted to speak, too cold to sleep. The rain continued, relentless, filling the foxholes until the men were sitting in water up to their waists. Some of them were shivering so violently they could not hold their rifles steady. Others had simply shut down, staring at nothing, waiting for the end. Culage moved among them, checking on each one, redistributing the last of the ammunition, making sure they knew where the others were in case the fighting started again. He did not sleep. He did not allow himself to sleep. Leadership was the only thing holding them together, and if he broke, they would all break. The Germans did not attack that night. Culage did not know why. Perhaps they were regrouping. Perhaps they were waiting for reinforcements. Perhaps they had taken enough casualties that they needed time to evacuate their wounded. Whatever the reason, the silence was both a blessing and a torment. It gave his men time to rest, but it also gave them time to think, and thinking in a situation like this was dangerous. Fear grows in silence. Doubt festers. By dawn, Culage could see it in their eyes. They were wondering if anyone even knew they were here. They were wondering if anyone cared. The fourth day began with the sound of engines. Culage heard them first, a low rumble coming from the east growing louder. He knew that sound. Armor. He climbed out of his foxhole, stood at the edge of the clearing, and strained to see through the trees. The fog was lighter today, and after a moment he saw movement. A German tank, possibly a Panzer IV, rolling slowly up the trail toward the hill. Behind it, infantry, maybe 30 or 40 men, moving in a loose skirmish line. Culage felt something cold settle in his stomach. They had held against infantry. They had survived mortars, but armor was different. Armor was invincible. You could not stop a tank with rifles and machine guns. You needed anti-tank weapons, and they had exactly one bazooka with exactly 2 rockets. He ran to the position where the bazooka was kept, found the man assigned to it, a corporal named Jensen who looked about 16 years old. Jensen's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the weapon. Culage took it from him, checked the rocket, loaded it, and handed it back. He told Jensen exactly what to do. Wait until the tank was close. Aim for the tracks or the side armor. Do not miss. Jensen nodded, his face pale, and Culage left him and returned to his own position. The tank rolled into the clearing slowly, its gun turret traversing back and forth, searching for targets. The infantry spread out behind it, using the armor as cover. Culage held his fire, waiting for the right moment. He glanced at Jensen, saw him raise the bazooka, saw him sight on the tank. Everything seemed to slow down. Jensen fired. The rocket streaked across the clearing, trailing smoke, and struck the tank's front armor with a sharp crack. For a moment, Culage thought it had worked. Then he saw the rocket bounce off, a dud, skittering away into the mud without exploding. The tank did not even slow. Its turret swung toward Jensen's position, and Culage knew what was coming next. He shouted for Jensen to get down, but the words were lost in the roar of the tank's main gun. The shell hit the foxhole directly, and Jensen ceased to exist. The remaining Americans opened fire on the infantry, pouring everything they had into the German soldiers. Men fell, but more kept coming, emboldened by the presence of the tank. The tank fired again, and another foxhole disappeared in a fountain of dirt and fire. Culage realized with perfect clarity that they were out of time. They could not fight a tank. They could not stop what was happening. In another minute, maybe 2, they would all be dead. That was when the tank stopped. The turret hatch opened, and a German officer climbed out. He stood on top of the tank, exposed, unarmed, and shouted something in heavily accented English. Culage could not make out the words over the gunfire. The officer shouted again, louder this time, and gestured for his men to cease fire. The shooting tapered off, stopped. The clearing went silent except for the idling engine of the tank. The officer looked directly at Culage and spoke. "Surrender, you have fought well. You are surrounded. You have no chance. Surrender now, and you will be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. You have my word as an officer." Culage stood up slowly. He was covered in mud and blood. His rifle was empty. He had 4 men left, all of them wounded, all of them staring at him, waiting for him to make the decision that would determine whether they lived or died. The German officer was right. They were surrounded. They had no ammunition. They had no support. Surrender was the rational choice. It was the only choice. Culage looked at the German officer. He thought about the 3 men who had been erased by mortar shells. He thought about Jensen, vaporized by the tank. He thought about the 14 months he had spent fighting across Europe, the friends he had buried, the promises he had made to himself about what he would and would not accept. He thought about the fact that if he surrendered, the Germans would take this hill, and whatever small strategic value it had would be lost, and other Americans would have to fight to take it back, and some of them would die doing it. He thought about all of this in the space of perhaps 3 seconds. Then he said no. The word hung in the air. The German officer stared at him, clearly not believing what he had heard. He repeated his offer, more forcefully this time, his voice taking on an edge of anger. Culage did not move. He just stood there, his empty rifle in his hands, and said no again. The German officer's face darkened. He said something in German to his men, something sharp and clipped, and dropped back into the tank. The hatch closed. The turret began to turn, the gun barrel swinging toward Culage's position. Culage knew he had seconds to live. He did not run. He just stood there, watching the gun barrel, and waited. The tank fired, but not at Culage. It fired at the tree line behind the American position, a suppressing shot meant to keep heads down. Then the German infantry surged forward, rushing the foxholes, and Culage realized what was happening. The Germans were not going to kill them from a distance. They were going to overrun the position and take them by force. Culage dropped into his foxhole and grabbed the last thing he had left. A grenade tucked into his belt, one he had been saving without really knowing why. He pulled the pin, counted to 2, and hurled it into the mass of advancing Germans. It exploded in midair and men went down. His remaining soldiers, seeing this, found grenades they had forgotten they had, grenades tucked into pockets or buried in the mud at the bottom of their foxholes, and they threw them all at once. The clearing erupted in explosions, and the German advance faltered. Culage did not wait to see what happened next. He shouted for his men to pull back, to get out of the foxholes and move into the forest behind them. They obeyed instantly, scrambling out of their positions and running, stumbling, crawling toward the trees. Culage covered them, firing his pistol even though he had no targets, just firing to make noise, to create confusion. The Germans were regrouping, and the tank was turning, and he had maybe 10 seconds before they were all dead. He made it to the tree line, felt branches close around him, heard his men crashing through the undergrowth ahead. Behind him, the tank fired again, the shells screaming past and detonating somewhere in the forest. He did not look back. He just ran, following the sound of his men, trusting that they knew where they were going even though he did not. They ran for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The forest swallowed them, hid them, and the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance. Finally, gasping for air, Culage called a halt. They collapsed in a small ravine hidden by ferns and deadfall and lay there trying not to make any sound. Culage counted them, 5 including himself. 7 dead left behind on that hill. He felt the weight of it settle on him, heavy and permanent, and he closed his eyes. They stayed hidden until nightfall, then began moving west, navigating by the stars when they could see them through the clouds. They walked all night, supporting each other, saying nothing. At dawn, they stumbled into an American outpost, and the soldiers there stared at them like they were ghosts. Culage identified himself, reported what had happened, and then sat down heavily on the ground because his legs would not hold him anymore. Later, much later, someone would write up a report. Someone would interview the survivors. Someone would decide that what Technical Sergeant Charles Culage had done on Hill 623 warranted recognition, and he would be awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation would speak of extraordinary heroism, of leadership under fire, of tactical brilliance and unshakable courage. Culage would accept the medal because refusing it would have dishonored the men who died, but he would never talk about it afterward. He would go home after the war, marry, have children, work a quiet job, and tell almost no one what had happened in those 4 days in October. When people asked about his war, he would change the subject. When reporters tried to interview him, he would decline. The memories were not something he wanted to revisit, and the medal was not something he felt he deserved. He would live into his 80s, a quiet man in a small town, known to his neighbors as someone who kept to himself but who would always help if you needed it. He would die peacefully, surrounded by family, and very few people at his funeral would know that the old man in the casket had once stood on a muddy hill in France and refused to surrender to a German tank. The story would fade, buried under decades and the weight of other wars, other heroes, other forgotten moments of courage. But the story deserves to be remembered, not because it was unique, though in its details it was, not because it was the most important battle of the war, because it was not, but because it shows something essential about what human beings are capable of when everything is taken away except the choice of whether to give up or keep going. Charles Culage and his men were not superheroes. They were not specially trained elite soldiers. They were ordinary young men, most of them barely out of childhood, who found themselves in a situation that offered no good options and chose the hardest path available. They chose to fight when fighting was hopeless. They chose to stand when standing meant dying. And when surrender was offered, when mercy was extended and survival was guaranteed, they chose to refuse because something in them, something deeper than fear or exhaustion or rational calculation, would not allow them to quit. That choice, that refusal, is worth remembering. It is worth honoring. It is worth telling to people who were not there, who will never face that kind of test, so that they might understand what courage actually looks like. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is not confidence in victory. It is the choice to act rightly when action is terrifying and outcome is uncertain. It is a 23-year-old sergeant standing in the rain with an empty rifle, looking at a tank and saying no. If this story moved you, if you believe that moments like this should not be forgotten, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories matter. They matter because they remind us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things. They matter because they show us that heroism is not something reserved for legends and myths, but something that happens in the mud and the rain when no one is watching except the people who depend on you. Down in the comments, I want to ask you a question. What would you have done in Culage's position? Would you have surrendered to save your men, or would you have refused? And whatever your answer, tell us what city, state, or country you are watching from. Let us know that these stories are reaching people, that this history still matters, that we are keeping these memories alive together. Thank you for watching, and remember, the greatest acts of courage are often the ones that no one sees.